So today we're going to talk about the story and lessons from one of my favorite historical trading figures, Jeffy, Jesse Livermore. Um, so I'm just going to start with a summary of his life and times, and then we're going to go on to some interesting bits from his book, a book sort of based about him, Reminiscences of a Stock Operator. I'm going to include my commentary and thinking along the way, and hopefully everyone enjoys it. So let's get right into it. So Jesse Livermore was born in July 26, 1877 in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, which isn't that far from, where I was born myself. Well, I mean, I guess it is kind of far, but in the grand scheme of things, the world over, it's not that far from myself. He apparently learned to read at an early age, and he was very smart. But he also lived on a farm, and life was really tough in 1877. So he ran away at 14. I guess he kind of ran away. I mean, it seemed like his parents were okay with it. Anyway, he left home early at the age of 14 to go find some work in the city of Boston. He got work pretty quickly once he got there to basically post quotes at a stock boy at Payne Weber for $5 a week. And this is, when he first kind of got his exposure to the industrial side of the market and his first little bits in, trading or exposure to trading, open outcry and everything like that. So apparently, it said at 15 he made his first trade. He made $3 betting on Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad at a bucket shop. So a bucket shop, interesting enough. So back in the day, before the whole everything was all automated and electronic, and even outside of the major exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and places like this, there were these places they were called all sorts of things, but people called them bucket shops. And it was essentially like a kind of a shady brokerage back in the day. So what they would do is they would have either some sort of, model way back when, or they would have some sort of telegraph machine or something like that, and they would have access to the data from the exchanges themselves, and then they would basically run a sort of dark pool in what we would call a dark pool in the modern sense, where they would be a kind of private market in their little bucket shop with, the people would come there and they would bet, and, the market would be trading, $5 for a stock, and they would be quoting it at $5 and a nickel, and people would buy and sell, and they would get a nickel in every trade, and then the people there made and lost money amongst themselves, and then anything extra at the end of the day they package up and bring over to the markets and settle up. Well, it probably wasn't the end of the day, it was probably the month or even longer back then. Things took a long time back then to get settled. But it was a way for people that weren't part of, I guess, main or industrial finance, people that weren't bankers on Wall Street and stuff, to, gamble, basically. But it was kind of, it was a rigged system. It was very private and internal, and most people there lost money, which is, similar to a lot of private things these days. I guess another way to think about it is what's very similar to bucket shops in today's market is all of these prop firms, they call them. And it's not the exact same model. It's very different in the way that people, basically pay membership to join a sort of club, basically. But I mean, aside from that, it's similar where they're pooling everything privately and they're settling up at the market as they do, and yada yada yada. So. If you're looking what happened to the bucket shops, they didn't go away. They still exist. Anyways, so back to the story. Earning his nickname, the Boy Plunger, by 16, he'd quit his job to trade full-time in the bucket shops. it was pretty good because, he'd seen behind the curtain enough, and he knew kind of how the sausage got made. So he made a bunch of money exploiting the way he knew how they worked. And he made so much money doing this that he got kicked out and banned from most of the bucket shops. So by his early adulthood, he'd accumulated well over $1,000, which is, a decent amount of money, equivalent to today's money. And this is 1877, remember. That's enough to buy, probably a carriage and a nice horse. I don't know what you'd buy in 1877, but, anyways. So after that, it seems he moved to New York City. Because he got banned from all his local bucket shops, so he had to move to New York. And yeah, it was different than the bucket shops because apparently he had some early losses, and kind of had to learn how to redo things on the New York Stock Exchange floor with early outcry or open outcry versus just being around the bucket shops, which he learned to do one thing and things changed, and he had to learn how to do things differently. Anyways, so he just was doing some trading and stuff, and he made a name for himself after doing that for a little bit because he made a bunch of money selling everything in the Panic of 1907. Interesting enough. So anyways, while he was doing this, he got married to Nettie Jordan. And then they divorced 17 years later, after he went bankrupt the first time. He got married to Dorothy, and they had 2 sons, and that lasted about 17 years again. And then his last marriage, which lasted until he passed away. So he was known for being very disciplined, relatively. I mean, as much as you can say for someone who went bankrupt multiple times. But he had a very, at least for the time, a very rule-based system. He was very technical and sort of statistical in the way he ran things. And he's known for sort of being the first, not the first, but, one of the early people that gets written about for this sort of things. Because, too much more before this, the markets didn't really exist when you think about it. Like, if you go back, into the late 1700s when the country was first founded, it took them 50-something years or so to start getting a real good market going. So he was pretty early on in the game, even though he was, in the turn of the 19th century there, or 20th century. Yeah. Anyways, so final years, he, after making a ton of money, and then making a ton of money again, in the 2 crashes, he ended up not doing very well. Lost a bunch of money after 1930. He wrote a book in 1940. It didn't really do that good, and he was kind of a depressed guy. So, yeah. Anyways, he took his own life in 1940. So that's quite the story. Ups and downs, but there's a lot we can learn from him, and I like the story. I don't know if I like the story, but I was interested in the story because it's, as far as time, as far back, there's a lot of people you can read about that are, have a lot of details written about them. But they're all relatively recent. And then there's a lot of people you can learn a little bit about from a long time ago. But there's not a lot of people from a long time ago you can learn a whole lot about. So this is one of those characters where you can do both, and that's why he's interesting, at least to me. And he, we can take a lot out of that. So let's talk a little bit about some of his books and stuff and some of the things he wrote. After I take a sip of coffee, obviously. So he was one of the, I don't know if he was the first, but he was a price purist, let's call it, where he was very big about how the market communicates through price. And if you think about the whole efficient market hypothesis and all that math and stuff they did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was actually kind of ahead of what a lot of people were talking about at the time. And this starts with one of his, foundational principles of speculation is written. Observe what the market does, not what people say. Which is, that's true. It's true for today. Like, the market is relatively efficient. It takes in information very fast, and you're going to learn a lot more from being observant at what things do and what is actually done in the world than listening to one source or the other tell you this thing or that thing. So he was also big on trends. So I mean, like, really, there's two ways you can trade, right? You can look for reversals where the market extends to somewhere and you're looking for it to go back to where it was, or you're looking for an extension or a trend where the market's, leaving where it was and going somewhere new. And I mean, it's kind of a lazy way to define it because that just kind of by its function sorts everything the market can do in one of those two buckets. But anyway, so he was a price purist. He was a trend purist, and he was the one who wrote "The Trend Is Your Friend." I think stay in the major trend and don't get shaken out by the smaller fluctuations. Written by a character or said by a character in one of the books. That's and really the moral of the books were that a lot of it is more about psychology and emotion than and getting around those hurdles to execute well versus anything else. So it's all about hope, fear, greed. People are why people take profits too early and they hold their losses longer, and how this behavior stems from human nature and logical fallacies that a lot of people share, and why the market acts the way it does based on that, which forms the foundation of the market's logic itself. So, and this can be broken into his core tenet, I guess you could say, which is that you gotta cut your losses quickly and then build and let your winners run. So small losses are acceptable, large losses are fatal, and the biggest wins come from holding and building onto winning positions through normal corrections. He stresses never averaging down into a losing position, even though it's a feel-good thing. He calls it a psychological trap. And it's very telling because some of his, if you look into the details of his life, some of his worst losses were from averaging down into losing positions. So he's writing this after the fact, but it's definitely something he learned himself, right? And he writes, that being correct is great, but timing matters more than being right is the way they put it. But or the way it is put in the books and stuff, but it's more that execution is more important than like thesis, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you're eventually right or if you kind of know what's going on over a wall. You got to be able to execute on that information or it's not going to do very good for you. So Livermore often predicts direction correctly but loses money because his timing is off, and he stresses big about the lessons he learned from basically that being early is the same as being wrong. He stresses patience a lot. He waits for confirmation on the trend from the market on his views before entering. And patience and the line of least resistance is a recurring theme in his writings. He talks a lot about bias and trend bias, and he says it's more about overall market direction and how the feeling of everyone in the market is than focusing on individual isolated stocks or stories that bind traders to their positions or blind them to the broader trend. So a couple things that were important that he lists. The first one is independence of thought. Successful traders got to ignore the tips, rumors, and crowd sentiment. And he stresses this because he repeatedly loses money when listening to other people, which I'm sure we can all kind of, that's, always feels that way. He talks about loneliness a lot. It's a very isolating endeavor. Because part of, I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand, right? If you're gonna ignore tips, rumors, and crowd sentiment, you're gonna be kind of a lonely person. You're not gonna talk to a lot of people, and then learn your mistakes once and don't repeat them. it's another thing. So yeah. Anyways, I like a lot of things that he talks about. I like a lot of lessons he gives on trend and particularly risk management. I've always found that myself, that cutting losers quickly and building onto winners is the key to doing anything great, right? Is just kind of nature of the beast. No matter what your strategy is, if you're cutting losers fast and building on the winners to make them big, you're probably doing okay. We can learn about, try to keep your head up. Don't get too depressed like this guy does, because he's kind of a sad figure. He writes a lot of sad stuff. He's a sad guy a lot. So I'm trying to enjoy life outside of this and don't get too carried away with risk, because it can be fatal. Anyways, yeah.